great English anthropologist, Evans Pritchard, he said that it's not the length of an experience that matters, but the intensity of the experience. Most people told me I was crazy, what I want to do that for, but it sounded like a wildly exciting opportunity, and it turned out to be the best thing I ever did. And I suppose those 3 years that I spent in the Lamarck remains for me the most intense experience of that kind that I certainly have had. In the beginning existed in solitude Raja Gantala, king of the spirits, possessed of a soul with organs for hearing, speaking, and seeing, but destitute of any other limbs or members. By an act of will, Raja Gantala created 2 bird spirits, Ara and Irik. Swooping down, they gathered 2 solid substances like eggs. From one of these, Ara formed the sky. From the other, Irik formed the earth. They then created the Batang Lupa, which was the first of waters and the mother of rivers. And with the aid of water, molded 2 human beings, 1 male, 1 female, infusing into their veins the gum of the kumpang tree, which is of a red color. Raja Gantala called to them. They answered. The birds cut them, and blood flowed from their wounds. And as the day waxed hot, sweat oozed through their skin. The first of the Iban. The first time that I became aware of the Iban was as a schoolboy. The old geography books, and I remember one from my relatively young school days, talked about different ethnic groups in different countries. You had people from around the world, and there would be a little picture, usually one of those sepia pictures. Well, I remember one well from Borneo, because the famous group were the headhunters of Borneo. That's what they were known as. And the one I remember most vividly actually is this picture of a man who presumably was a headhunter, wearing a very fine feathered headdress. He was wearing a loincloth, he was carrying a shield, a very ferocious-looking knife, described as a brave. And that was the image which I had in the back of my mind when I arrived and sailed up that first river into the interior. Even before venturing into the interior, I caught my first glimpse of a traditional Iban. As the boat was approaching the Batang Lupa River, I noticed a man with long, glossy hair combed into a fringe over his forehead. His ears pierced and extended. His face bore that curiously vacant, even sinister expression that comes from eyelashes and eyebrows being plucked. His body, meshed in tattoos, was naked, except for a red loincloth wrapped tightly round his middle and looped behind like the tail feathers of a cock. Alive before me was a full-colour original of that sepia photograph I'd seen as a boy. I was enchanted, but by the time we disembarked, he was nowhere to be seen. Research was the main reason for my going to Sarawak, but the more I came to know the Iban, the more I came to understand their problems and the challenges they faced in a changing world, and to sympathize with them. I'd been in Sarawak for upwards of a year. One day I suddenly heard that there had been what was described as a rebellion, an uprising, in another river, the Lamanak. The reason for the uprising was because the Lamanak Iban had been farming the land for centuries. The Iban traditional way of life revolved around and depended upon the cultivation of hill rice. The tribal group would arrive in an area and they would begin clearing patches in the forest. They felled trees and cut undergrowth, then burned to leave a fertile area for planting. They would plant and harvest rice in the same district for some 15 years until the relatively poor jungle soil became infertile, at which point they would mass migrate to another area, build a new longhouse, and start the cycle again. The Iban called this migration Pinda, and it was central to their way of life. As the Iban population grew over time, it was becoming impossible for them to migrate as they had done for centuries without destroying protected rainforests or invading the territories of other tribes. It was for these reasons that the Sarawak government made it policy to transition the Iban to a settled way of life. With their rice harvest failing, the Iban of the Lamanak were at crisis point. Someone was needed to venture into that hostile environment, the government commissioner said. So I outlined, with a degree of confidence to which I suppose I wasn't really entitled, a little development scheme, which would go into this area, say to the people, look, let's think through together how we can make this a good place for you and indeed for your children and grandchildren to live. And then he turns to me and says, rather disarmingly, would you like to do it? Well, I'll be completely honest, I had not expected that. But of course, well, this was just the most exciting thing I could possibly have been asked to do. It was the opportunity that I suppose in an unfocused way I had almost dreamt of. Now I'm planning and very much wanting to go back. I want to see how the Iban are faring in the 21st century, to see the impact on their unique culture of changes that we encouraged, and to know whether these have served the Iban well, and revisit those places and people with whom I fell in love with 50 years ago. From Kuching, Sarawak's capital, I'm now on my way to Sri Aman. Semangang it was called when in 1959 I first ventured on into the interior to live among the Iban, learn their language and research their culture.
Well, this really is pretty extraordinary to find myself sitting in a coach, a modern coach with rather well equipped, well appointed. It's just a little bit bumpy, I have to be honest. It's going to get us from Kuching to Sri Aman, as it's now called, the old Semangang, in 2 or 3 hours. When I think back, to get to the same place from Kuching, it was a journey of a couple of days. It could be longer. I can't wait to get back to Semangang and see how that's changed. When I see all these cars, as you do on any road in all parts of the world, but when I first arrived in Semangang, would you believe it, there was one car. I've often wondered how it got there. They must have bought a special launch for it, or lighter or something else, but there was one car. I suspect when we get there now, there's going to be quite a lot more. They probably even have traffic problems, and you won't know where to park.
Hello, Nani. Hey, kami baru datang ke Semangang. Enggak bas, ni nak bas. Nama prisoner mana? Okay. Pukul berapa malam tu? Pukul berapa kita semua? Pukul 7.
The Iban of the Lamanak did not make me welcome. The headmen, Sa and Melintang, tried to obstruct all my efforts, every attempt to introduce new ideas. Poisoning was rumoured and curses rife intended to frighten me away. They believed that if they could force me out, Pindar would be permitted. And that was where they were wrong. Pindar had become strictly illegal, and the only hope was to find a new way forward. I couldn't impose anything. I had no mandate to do so. I had no powers to do so. The only way I could achieve anything was to build up the Iban's confidence in me, that I was honest, that I knew what I was talking about, and that, by and large, that I could deliver on anything I promised. To help me implement the scheme, I recruited some forward-looking young Iban from a more progressive area. Nani, who turned out to have quite extraordinary qualities and became a principal pillar of the scheme as it evolved.
Agi
And then there was Jabba. Never forget Jabba. And she walked so fast that one always feared that she'd fall over her own feet. But she went around the longhouses and introduced vegetable gardening with real impact on the people's diet. And then came Klunchai. He had a fair amount of schooling, and he was able to do a course in outboard maintenance and boats, and he was in charge of our outboard and all that side of things.
Aku senang amai uli desai desai. Beda semua kita baru.
Ramping, his schoolmate who came with him, was in charge of our carpentry work, and again showed real qualities in that area. Also came Dundang, who had a quite extraordinary feeling for fish ponds and fisheries. He was in his element. We were able to create this little team, and I think the difficulty of being there created a bond, which was very real. And they were the ones who kept me going. And after 3 long years, the Lamanak Iban, at first so resistant, told us that we had changed their lives for the better. That was the most gratifying thing.
Kita lumang nadagi, Suncai nadagi, Kalam nadagi. Selalu ingat kah? Sudah pakai kamu sepilih kah?
We are all very serious and very old.
Well, I think perhaps the time has come for me to say thank you, Nani, particularly for organising this evening, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for what you did all those years ago. Terima kasih.
We also say thank you very, very much.
It's been a very emotional evening for me. I've had the opportunity, and it's been a wonderful opportunity, to meet up again with the survivors of the group who worked with me in the Lamanak when we were all so very young. Of course, they've changed, they've grown, but they're still so much the same people. It was a peculiarly bonding experience. Conditions were extremely difficult, and they were able to share in the success which we achieved towards the end. I now look forward to their accompanying me as we return to the Lamanak to see the lasting effects of our efforts to instill new ways of making a living. At dinner last night, Nanny mentioned her great niece, Eunice, who lives in the town with her parents. Eunice and her friends in Sriaman enjoy the trappings of modern teenage living. In just 2 short generations, there's been this dramatic change in their way of life. And young Iban today have opportunities open to them that simply didn't exist before. I wonder how much of their cultural heritage has been passed down to them, and what being an Iban means to them.
One Direction!
Liam, Zayn, Harry Styles. Still love them. Still always remains in our hearts. Directioners forever. I would for the university for the next few years I would like to go to London, California, Canada, Australia. So I really hope I can make it there.
My dream is to go to Korea.
Of course.
To meet my favorite idols. Yeah, you know. Typical.
My dream job is to be a successful doctor. In Sarawak, some of the villages, they don't have any hospitals. Also, I'm in Iban, and my hometown is very poor sometimes, and they had to travel a long distance to the towns, especially in Kuching. So it's my dream job to be a doctor one day and to make my parents proud.
Together with Eunice, as well as Nani, Bida, Rhoda and Jabba, I'm on my way to Sarubal, which was one of the longhouses involved in our development scheme. It'll be fascinating to see how happily adjusted to a settled way of life the people now are, how they live, and what survives of the past. An Iban Gawai, a religious ceremony, is planned, a minor rite on this occasion, but incorporating traditional elements, and that includes the Iban dancing, to which I look especially forward.
Okay, let's go to the longhouse.
As we approach the longhouse, we're met by the headman's sister.
The first thing I remember is I'm scared of you.
One aspect of Iban culture that is especially characteristic of their way of life is the longhouse. It's one of the most ancient forms of dwelling still in existence to this day. A traditional longhouse would be raised off the ground on strong Belian ironwood posts. This helped prevent jungle animals and enemies from getting in. A notched log would be used as a ladder to enter. Each family would have its cross-section, a room, the bilik, where they would sleep and eat, etc., leading on to the ruai, which stretched, unwalled, from one end of the longhouse to the other. This was a space for receiving visitors, socializing with neighbors, basket-making, religious ceremonies, and other group activities. Beyond that, unroofed, was a platform area, the tanju, used for winnowing and drying paddy and to hang washing. Underneath the longhouse, the pigs would live on waste dropped from above. Longhouse life is largely communal and is central to the Iban culture. Iban don't like being alone. It's often said that you can take an Iban out of the longhouse, but you can't take the longhouse out of an Iban.
You want to tour Roma? Top bilik no.
Today's longhouse follows the traditional floor plan from the front. But behind each family room, there are more rooms with modern appliances amid the heirlooms. And a lavatory.
Come quite a long way from trying to outstare the pigs. And my God, a washing machine.
When I first went into the interior in 1959 and found I had to wash and bathe in the river, I quickly realized that shaving was going to be a real challenge. So I decided to grow a beard. Beards were a rarity in Upriver Sarawak, and I was given the name Tuan Ragum, meaning Lord with Beard. The name stuck. That's how I became known to the Iban. I'm still called Tuan Ragum by many to this day.
Now we're offering a sacrifice to the Iban god. which was intended, of course, at this particular festival to obtain their blessing for the season, the agricultural season to come. Various things are offered. Tuak, which is the traditional Iban distillation from rice, and then various other desirable things such as sweet glutinous rice wrapped in bamboo. This is puffed rice that we're now offering. Here it comes. Here comes the cockerel to be waved over the offering in, as I said, a ceremonial invocation.
Sampai kembang bunyi ruai mau tate baleng ngabang nama semeta bunyi taja maka lebak perawan nindang sampai nyada ngai padu ngangau ngai lejo kami segera tadi tu. Oh bisa. Orang buam tu. Ya kita jadi apa kami dia ubah.
Dato Erik Jensan.
Aku mau tak pareng nada lama nada dia indai imbok di itu tumbang nama midang. Tinggal lampang tapi anui hari sungkuk, hari lapuk, hari pendam, hari penjaran, hari itu buang, hari raruang. Kita punya, kita ngilai unur berayuang, kita ngelangit nyengok engkar. Kami duna tu ragum kita, lapan benda dunia, benda menua kami itu, nak sakar itu. Kami ya pulai lah, kita menua kiannya. Ya nanti cerita, mesti kita ke pedak ya. Mana? Mana serubah? Ya, nak kali. Lah. Masih besar eh? Sekalian saja.
Pandai ya.
Orang pandai. Pandai apa ketua? Agak besar. Oha.
I couldn't help. I was really very moved by that invocation, that prayer. It's usually very formal that you invoke the Iban gods and so forth, but he included me in it all the way along, saying how indebted they were to what I brought to their lives, like a sort of, I suppose, the influence of a god. It was, no, let's not put too much into that, but it was very, very moving, the kind of tribute. It really was, and I noticed that the others noticed it too. Not always usual, but very, very nice, very nice.
Najat is the Iban classical dance. It's the dance that's performed on all important occasions, and it actually represents, in a very stylized way, a headhunting expedition. You can see it. The man carries the particular sword, carries his shield, and if you look carefully, you'll see him steal forth at first, and then he encounters the enemy, and there's a lot of whooping and slashing of swords, and then he takes the head, and that's it. One of the things one can't help remembering is when I first visited a longhouse and the gongs came out and people started dancing, and then at a certain moment people came across and they dragged me. And I said, I don't know, I've never done it, I have no idea, I don't know how to do this. And they dragged me onto the floor, and everyone in a rather good-natured way laughed at me as I performed a ludicrous imitation of what was meant to be the Najat. I see that the same thing is happening now that I'm older and much less adept.
All right. Not anymore. Not anymore. Not anymore. Now try. Actually, I can't help laughing because I've been brought a chair. I must say, this is the ultimate indignity in many ways, but it's very sweet and hospitable and kind, because chairs, if you look around the longhouse, don't normally exist. And I can't help remembering the first governor to be appointed to the colonial administration, when Sarawak became a colony after the Brooks left, came from Africa, and he was used to sitting rather grandly on a chair when he toured around. And when he visited the longhouse, he sat on a chair. He had to be reprimanded by the chief secretary, who said, in Sarawak, even the governor sits on the floor like everybody else. One of them giggled a little bit when I got up just now and said, he gets up like a cow, which I suppose is true.
Among today's educated young Iban, such as those who live in Sriaman, there are a few who are learning how to dance the Najat in a modernized form. Eunice is among these. She's a young Iban woman with a real interest in her traditions and her culture. And now she's being asked to appear for the first time in the Najat's true setting, the Longhouse.
Is this the first time? And I must say, she looks absolutely lovely in the costume as well. Bravo, bravo, bravo.
There are things which are so much the same when you look out over the jungle. The structure, the layout of the Longhouse, and then you see the enormous changes. You can drive here, you can drive here. Road, electricity, and indeed the confidence of the people. They're better off, no question. And then there's much the same. The welcome, the warmth, and she's rather charming. People to remember, I mean, many by repute rather personal. It's after all 50 years since we left this area. We changed their lives. Having witnessed much change, I'm now heading further upriver, across old Iban lands submerged under a vast lake created by a hydroelectric project. Dead trees poke like fingers from the surface. It resembles boringly repetitive installation art on a monstrous scale to the theme Memento Mori. I'm looking forward to seeing to what extent traditional Iban culture survives in the remote interior.
We've left the lake, well, that artificial lake really, and now we're going into the rivers of Sarawak as I knew them. Not that many left like this anymore, but it really is magical. There's no other word for it. There's this wonderful light that falls on the water, comes through the great big trees. You have these arching trees, almost like being in a cathedral of vegetation. And then the banks pitted with little holes, and you wonder what lives there. You know something does, you're not quite sure what. The river itself has always been very important to the Iban, the source of not only, of course, where they washed and where they fished, but also their link with everything outside, everything beyond. It was their link with the world. I'm so pleased to be able to come back and be in a boat on a river with this atmosphere, because this for me was in many ways the essence of well, certainly it was the way we traveled. It was the only way to travel, except on foot. It's a very, very special environment.
We've stopped at a tourist lodge, which is sited for tourists to see the elusive orangutan in one of the very few places where they survive in the wild. By contributing to the local economy, tourism supports the Iban community's traditional way of life, together with that of the orangutan. Later in the day, the headman's daughter is kind enough to allow me to watch as she weaves a modern form of pur ceremonial cloth. Pur weaving is now recognized as a great cultural achievement, but there was a real danger that it would disappear. It has sometimes been characterized as the women's answer to headhunting, the way a woman achieved greatness in society.
Lama tu. Laban nak selalu ngagak. Ngena nama tu beman kini ang tanya agak pindah kita agak ngena tali niluan nganyam dalam buang tu.
Yeah. She's from her mother.
And she's following her mother's guidance in this. And this will be the heirloom of the future.
Cash crops were basic, fish ponds highly valued, but fruit and vegetable gardening were very important contributions to Iban Dad, previously so dependent on jungle produce, although wild plants had a continuing role. Over breakfast, I happened to have discovered that our guide Teddy is by way of being something of an expert in traditional Iban medicine. And he's now very kindly offered to take us out and show us the jungle plants that he's cultivating and explain a bit about the ailments that they're used to treat.
See, forest is like our pharmacy. It's like our supermarket. What's important is we must know what to take and what not to consume.
Yeah.
I'm very keen to find out to what extent this knowledge is being preserved for the benefit of future generations and indeed for the wider world.
Now tell me, what's this? This is something you've planted?
Actually, this one, they're growing wild. For local name, they call it bungkang. But this layer of leaf is also used if you have a normal or common diarrhea.
Okay.
Besides the delinia, we have wild ginger.
Yes.
This one, the roots or the stem or the heart itself is used to stop heavy bleeding when you have cuts and wounds.
Oh, really? No.
Okay, what I have here is a kind of wild yam family.
Which part of it?
It will be the roots.
The roots.
Yeah. And for this one, it actually has a strong antiseptic smell like that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
But rather nice.
Yeah.
Was this your grandfather or your great-grandfather?
I learned from my late great-grandfather.
But your great-grandfather lived
111.
111?
I've seen his birth certificate, born in 1866.
Did you find that many people knew them or just a few here and there?
Unfortunately, again, the younger people, the younger generation, they're not interested.
Really?
Yeah. They only knew basic plants.
Okay.
For stomach upset, for wounds, for stopping all the bleeding, heavy bleeding.
And snake bite, I imagine. No?
Not all.
No?
There's so many plants around here.
It's wonderful. Yeah. It's wonderful. Well, you must show me where the plant is that your great-grandfather took in order to live to be 110. That has to be a very special one.
It's just the bamboo.
Just the bamboo.
Yeah, just drink water kept in a bamboo tube.
Mm-hmm.
If it's boiled in the bamboo tube. That's it.
I need a lot of bamboo. Thank you very, very much. Yeah. It's been fascinating.
Yes, absolutely to show you around.
Absolutely.
I've heard that there's a longhouse further upriver where the headman still has his collection of trophies from the old headhunting days, which he'd be quite prepared for us to see. So we're back on the river, heading deeper into the interior. There was one aspect of traditional culture for which the Iban remained notorious above any other, and that was the practice of headhunting. The Iban believed that the head carried the human spirit, which could be captured if the head of an enemy was taken. War parties and headhunting forays, and Iban men in pursuit of personal glory would return with these trophies to the longhouse. There they would be received with elaborate ceremony on Pua, before being preserved by smoking in special huts. Afterwards, the heads would be hung in the longhouse in open weave baskets for all to see. As well as being considered proofs of individual valor, these heads were powerful trophies, essential in rites such as the ending of mourning, for status and general prosperity. Headhunting was outlawed by the White Raja of Sarawak in 1924. Although cases occurred even after that. Goodness, they're in fine shape, these old heads. I've seen heads in many longhouses. Many longhouses don't have them anymore. They don't keep them. Christian houses are encouraged not to keep them. Well, that accounts for it, I suppose, but here they are. I just asked the headman
whether he knew whose heads they once were. And he says, no, he doesn't, but he knows they go back quite a long way. I think some of them maybe in the 30s, 20s and so, probably a lot older than that in many cases. But they're in a fine state of preservation, so it's nice to see a few of the older generation.
It's been exciting to witness the continuing vitality of core traditional values and how much survives in the modern world. This is what our scheme was all about, and it did light a spark, and the ideas and practices have spread widely, benefiting many Iban lives. Now that I'm back in Kuching, I have one last person to meet, my old friend Tan Sri Lingyi. Lingyi is the son of the remarkable paramount chief of the Iban during my last years in Sarawak and also at the time of independence. And Lingyi has devoted his own very considerable energies and resources to creating a foundation to honor the memory of his father. It's called the Tun Juga Foundation. And the foundation is devoted to generating awareness of Iban culture and to keeping Iban culture and traditions alive.
In a country like Malaysia, where the Ibans are minority race, it is very, very important for that community itself to preserve their culture. What role does it play in our life in the past, and what could be fished out so that it can guide us to the present day actually, because as you and I know, the world changed so much, language change, habits change. So unless you have something for the people to refer to in terms of culture, habits, sanctions, and it will all disappear. I mean, the world changed so much, isn't it? I think the people often ask me, what makes Iban an Iban? I say culture. Your attitude towards life, your response to people. You have been to the Longhouse so many years ago. Now you return back to the place where you used to do your research and so on. See, the Longhouse is still there, but it changed, but the value is still there. And that's the value that we want to capture, to keep Iban and Iban.
Well, I have to admit, it is extraordinary to be back. I first came here some 55 years ago as an idealistic young man, and I remember thinking what an exciting, special place Sarawak was. It still is. Of course, it's changed. It's changed in many, many, many rather dramatic ways. It mattered to me to see whether the changes which I was in large measure responsible for bringing in, whether the Iban now feel that it was to their advantage. I don't suppose when I came out here all those years ago that I expected to learn from the Iban, but I did. I learned a very, very great deal. I learned about human relations, I learned about the way they treat other people, how they treat the old, how they treat the young, how they live in society. And it was a very valuable lesson which I continue to treasure. It's mattered hugely to me to have this opportunity to come back and see the places and the people who I fell in love with all those years ago.
Come on,